today's topic, as I said, working agile, and on the other hand, complying with standards. So what are we going to do? Are we going to work agile or comply with standards? Are we going to work agile enough to just still comply with the standards? Or are we going to try to make it work both hand in hand? So I can tell you, of course, the first option is not an option for us. We also wouldn't settle for just working a little bit agile enough to still comply with the standards. So it is really about working agile and complying with standards. And I know that both are often perceived actually more than opponents than as collaborators. But I will try to resolve this prejudice in the upcoming 45 minutes. And so with that being said, I'd like to jump into the agenda. First of all, of course, I'm going to introduce myself to you so that you know who you are talking to. Why did I choose the topics I chose? And after this, let's start with the contents. So at first, I'd like to talk about the contradictions and the commonalities of agile frameworks and ISO standards. And since I'm a Scrum Master, I will focus here on Scrum. And of course, there are other agile frameworks, but this is the one I will be referring to for this lecture. Then we have a short insight in the Scrum structure. So first, the Scrum roles, and then also the Scrum rituals and artifacts. After this, we'll make a switch to the general structure of the ISO standards. And then when we've talked about this, I would like to resolve these contradictions that are being said about the agile frameworks and the ISO standards. And that actually leading to the most important point. What is required from a database to make the two work together? And in the end, I'd like to address a dangerous myth that is often, that I hear very often when it comes to working agilely, when it comes to databases, and also when it comes to ISO standards. All right, so first about myself. My name is Christine Losolo. I live and work in Regensburg in South Germany, so just the same city where Hallo Welt is located. But right now, I'm in Warner Robins, that's near Atlanta in Georgia, USA, because for two reasons. One reason is family, so my sister lives here, and my niece graduated from university yesterday, and we attended the graduation ceremony. Was very proud of her, very different than it was in Regensburg. Or then we do these graduation ceremonies in Germany, so it was not only a big event for her, it was also a big event for me. And second, I'm here for business reasons, so I will be attending 2 networking meetings here in the area. But thanks God, thanks to remote working, I can do this lecture here today anyway. So I'm a quality auditor. I'm also information security officer and a Scrum Master. After I did my bachelor degree in international technology management, I've always been working in quality management related positions until I finally got the chance to work as quality management officer in the company where I was employed. And I was responsible for 2 sites. And I also did international audits, for example, at a subsidiary that we had in Italy. And this was before I then decided to start my own company. And now as CLBS Projektbüro, I do actually pretty much everything around integrated management systems, meaning if companies don't have their own quality official or need support when it comes to their management systems, I do the introduction, the maintenance, and the enhancements of the integrated management systems. I conduct first and second party audits. I host and prepare third party audits. Of course, I also do the process modeling and performance measuring, and I try to draw concepts for KPI measurings so that companies can keep track of their management system. And I'm also available for interim management positions. So then let's get started with the content. As I said in the beginning, there are supposed contradictions and there are commonalities between Agile frameworks on the one side and the ISO standards on the other side. So the first contradiction, what I hear very, very often is, well, I don't think ISO standards and Agile teams can go hand in hand because, you know, there are no disciplinary hierarchies in the Agile teams. And so who's going to be responsible, who is going to give approvals, etc. So this is what I hear very, very often, but both the Agile frameworks and the ISO standards have a commonality here, which faces this prejudice. And this is, okay, even though, and yes, in the Agile teams, there is no hierarchy in that sense, but there are very clear responsibilities that anyhow ensure that everyone plays his or her part in the team. Then what I hear also very often is that the traceability that is required by the standards, the traceability when it comes to documentation and when it comes to maybe changes in requirements for products and services, is somehow corrupted by the flexibility that is promoted by the Agile Manifesto. So it is often perceived as the Agile Manifesto allows you to just change a strategy on a product without really having to trace and to document this. But also here, what both have in common is there is a very, very clear focus on processes and results, as well in the standards as in the Agile frameworks. And these focus on processes and results will always require to also orderly process changes that you make to a strategy. And then in the end, the Agile Manifesto allegedly puts increments, so meaning the results of a working period, over documentation. And yes, the Agile Manifesto says that interaction and creating results is more important than documentation, but still it does not say that documentation is not important. And here again, there is a clear purpose of the rituals and the artifacts in the Scrum cycle. And this purpose of each ritual and each artifact actually makes this argument obsolete. Now, what are the rituals and what are the artifacts? On the two upcoming slides, I would like to explain to you how Scrum in generally works for people that haven't been working with the Scrum framework so far. So we're going to talk about the Scrum roles, and on the next slide, I will explain the rituals and the artifacts. I will not dive too deep into this, of course, since we only have limited time, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Before then, I proceed with the next slide, which explains the general structure of the ISO standards. All right, any questions on those supposed contradictions and commonalities so far before I proceed? All right, if there are any questions, just switch on your microphone and say, Christine, please give me a minute, or type a message in the chat and I will address it. All right, then starting with the Scrum roles. On the one hand, we have the market. On the other hand, we have the organization or the company. So market is being represented by customers and external stakeholders. Organization is being represented by the management and internal stakeholders. So those are the two positions where the Scrum team gets input from: market-related input, organization-related input. And then here, eyes and ears to the market, is the product owner. Product owner is the contact person for as I said, is the contact person for the market-related stakeholders and for the customers, and the product owner is also the one to collect information from the market and bring it into the company. Then, facing the management, this is the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master clarifies anything organizational that has to do with management and internal requirements to the Scrum team. And then in the middle, we have the research and development team. And it is not a coincidence that the product owner and the Scrum Master actually look like walls that shield the R&D team from the outside world, because this is the actual intention. So it is indeed the actual intention that the product owner collects information from the market, sort of filters the information that he gets from the market, and presents it to the R&D team in the form of specification, user stories, use cases, etc. And also, the Scrum Master shields the research and development team from the management. So if there are any management-related requirements, he would collect them, communicate with the Scrum team, and then also communicate with the management. But the function of the product owner and the Scrum Master is indeed to shield the Scrum team, to let them work in the R&D team, to let them work in peace. Of course, product owner and Scrum Master do communicate with each other. And these three functions in the middle, the product owner, the R&D team, and the Scrum Master, this is what we call the Scrum team. Any questions to the Scrum team? All right, if not, now I will proceed further to the rituals and the artifacts. And as I said, you always have the option to just interrupt and ask a question during the lecture. So how is this Scrum team working? What are the rituals and artifacts they are doing to actually produce products and services, develop products and services? So here are the rituals that they're doing over and over again. It starts with the sprint planning. Then we have the sprint, so the actual time period where the product or the service is being developed. During the sprint, there are daily scrums. And after the sprint, there's a sprint review and a sprint retrospective. Those have two different functions. And for these rituals, the Scrum team uses artifacts. So unfortunately, I cannot explain where this term artifact is rooted, but there are three artifacts that come in different shapes. So artifact number one is the so-called product item backlog. This is sort of a wish list where every feature, every functionality you would like a certain product, software to have. Any feature that you could think of is written down there in form of a use case or a user story. Then the second artifact is the sprint backlog. The sprint backlog is, let's say, an extract of the product backlog item, of the product backlog, meaning you choose product backlog items. You choose a certain number of product backlog items that you want to develop in one sprint. And then the third artifact is the so-called increment. That is the ready-to-use product, so the result of a sprint. These are the three artifacts that are being used. There are also other artifacts, like, for example, the impediments backlog, where you write down if there have been problems during the sprints, and so that you can draw lessons learned from that. But this is not one of the three official artifacts by the Scrum framework. So the three artifacts are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment, which is the ready-to-use product. Okay, so details about the sprint planning. The artifact that is being used here is the product backlog. And so in the sprint planning, the R&D team and the product owner, they are sitting down and discuss what to do in the upcoming sprint. And so the result of this sprint planning is the sprint backlog and the DOD, which means the definition of done. So the definition of done provides criteria which the increment needs to meet so that the sprint is being completed successfully. And responsible for the sprint planning is the product owner. Then the sprint itself. So the artifact for the sprint itself is the sprint backlog. The result is the increment. Responsible here is the R&D team. Then there's the daily scrum, which takes place every day during the sprint. Responsible here is the scrum master. But the scrum master is not necessarily a participant. The scrum master only makes sure that the R&D team are the obligatory participants, come together each day, plus individually invited person that they might need to discuss a certain issue that came up the last day. And just to get together to update each other on a daily basis about what's going on in the project. Then next is the sprint review. The sprint review, the artifact that is being used here is the increment. So the ready-to-use product, the result of the sprint. Responsible for the artifact is still the R&D team, but the responsible for the approval of the artifact is the product owner. And last but not least, the sprint retrospective. The sprint retrospective is not product focused. It is team focused. So the participants are, like the whole Scrum team comes together, and the purpose is to draw lessons learned. But as I said, not product focused, because product focus is the sprint review. The sprint retrospective is about how have we worked together? How did we cooperate as a team? How can we get even better? And the responsible for this is the Scrum Master. And this is the cycle that builds upon one another. And each time you have a sprint planning, the sprint and the daily scrum, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. And if you recall the graph that we've seen before, so why is the product owner responsible for the sprint planning and for the sprint review? Because here it is about what are we going to develop for the market, and is the product that we have developed ready to be presented to the market? So therefore, the product owner is responsible for those two rituals that are all about what are we going to present to the market. And the Scrum Master is responsible for the daily scrums, because this is an organizational issue. Because even though we're working in the same team, if there is a R&D team, it doesn't mean that they all have to be in the same place. Just as you see here, I work with Hallo Welt in Regensburg, but I am in Warner Robins, Georgia. And so this is why the Scrum Master has to make sure that the Scrum, that the R&D team has a possibility to come together on a daily basis and to exchange. And also the sprint retrospective, this is also about working together, about organizing the work together. And this is why the Scrum Master is responsible here. And the sprint itself, so the part where the actual work is being done, where the actual product is being developed, this is there the responsibility lies in the hand of the R&D team, shielded by the Scrum Master and by the product owner. So far for the insight into the Scrum structures. If there are no questions, I will now proceed to the general structure of the ISO standards. And by the end of this slide, you will also recognize also a very, very characteristic commonality of both the Scrum ritual and the Scrum cycle, the Scrum working cycle, and the ISO standards. So what are these standard chapters? Beginning with chapters 1, 2, and 3. These chapters are not very spectacular. These are very standard related. Here you just define for which part of the company the certification is being valid, which are the reference document that come together with the standard, and yeah, what are the terms and definitions? What is the explanation of the terms and definitions used in the standard? But chapter 4 and 5 gets more interesting. This is about the structure of the organization, the context of the organization. So what actually the organization tries to offer the market, and the leadership. And the leadership is, of course, the entity that introduces the Scrum team and provides the structure for the Scrum team to work. And now with chapter 6, we're going to enter the so-called Deming cycle. For those of you who are not familiar with the Deming cycle, don't bother. We will build up this cycle here together. If you ever heard of this plan, do, check, act cycle, this is the Deming cycle. And now I'm just going to display how this is embedded in the standards, in each ISO standard, actually. So it starts with chapter 6, planning, where on a medium term to strategic level, of course, the company plans its goals. So this accounts also for the plan section of the Deming cycle. Then chapter 7, support, and 8, operation. And here I point out documented information, and chapter 8.2, requirements for products and services, and 8.3, design and development of product and services. This is the part where the product is being created with the support of the documented information. So this accounts for the do section of the Deming cycle. Then chapter 9, performance evaluation. Are the results that we have been developing in chapter 7 and 8, do they support our company goals? Are we still on track with reaching our company goals? Is our performance the way we wanted it to be? This all takes place in chapter 9. And in the end, chapter 10, improvement. Improvement means, okay, what are going to be our next steps? Were we wrong in something that we did? So we need to make up for faults that we might have done, or did everything go well? But of course, we still don't want to settle for that. We want to improve. So what are we going to do to become even better? This accounts for the act section. And here you see the Deming cycle, plan, do, check, act. And now please recall the Scrum cycle, where you have the sprint planning, the sprint itself together with the daily Scrum, where the product is being developed. Then we have the sprint review, where the performance of the sprint is being evaluated. And there is the sprint retrospective, where the team sits down to draw lessons learned. So even though the Scrum cycle works on an operational level and the standard operates on a medium term to strategic level, the principle behind it are very, very similar. It is all about planning the next step, executing the next step, checking if we are still on track, and then trying to draw conclusions from this. And this is why actually the ISO standards and the agile frameworks do go hand in hand together very, very well. And now here you see these the chapters from 1 to 10. And this is called the so-called high-level structure. And just for you to know, all these standards, all the ISO standards that end by a 1, like ISO 9001 for quality management, like ISO 50001 for energy management, like ISO 27001 for information security. All these standards that end by a 1 follow the so-called high-level structure. So they all have the same structure of standard chapters. Even the sub-chapters are mostly the same in some chapters, in some standards, some sub-chapters just don't exist, but the structure is really the same. So the main chapters are the same, and the sub-chapters pretty much are also the same. And all right, I hope now it has become clear for you how actually the Agile frameworks and the ISO standards actually do work hand in hand because of the very similar principle of incremental development that they both promote. And now I'd like to jump to the next slide to actually resolve the contradictions that we have seen before. So I'd like to resolve those three contradictions by the commonalities that both have, and by linking the agile structures to the standard chapters. So we started with contradiction number one, that somehow the missing disciplinary hierarchy in the Scrum team that somehow the missing disciplinary hierarchy in the Scrum teams sort of corrupts the ISO standards. But as we've seen, even though there is no disciplinary hierarchy, there are very clear responsibilities. And those clear responsibilities in shape of the Scrum roles are being backed by the norm chapters that I have that you have just seen. This is chapter 5, leadership, where those responsibilities are made clear. There is chapter 6, planning, and this planning is of course a committed planning. And by making the Scrum team commit to the planning, of course, everyone has to play his or her part. And then there's chapter 6, documented information, meaning that even though we're talking about a Scrum team, there is an obligation to provide documented information. And also, what I deem very important is to make documentation a part of the sprint planning, but not also a part of the sprint planning, but also a part of the budgeting of the whole project, because documentation is very complex. Documentation has to cover very many different needs. And so documentation is nothing that you do on the side. It really should be a part of the project planning and of the project budgeting, because of course the resource that is going to provide the documentation also will cost money in the end of the day. Then, second contradiction, increments over documentation, facing rituals and the artifacts. Please recall that chart. So what do we have here? We do have a sprint planning where we define a definition of done. And if documentation is defined as a criteria of the definition of done, then also Scrum teams will in the end develop the necessary documentation needed to cover not only the customer's requirements, not only the requirements for the ISO standards, but also legal requirements that go hand in hand. And this is then backed by the chapter 7.5, of course, documented information, but also this documented information then supports chapter 9, where it is about evaluation of the performance, and also chapter 10. Once you have really documented your performance, you can use it for many different norm chapters. So there doesn't have to be separate documentation for chapter 9 or chapter 10. If it's done comprehensively, one set of documentation is good for various chapters of these standards. And then we have traceability versus flexibility. There we have the processes and the results. And here I think it is very important to, as I said, document the results of the sprint review. And if those results of the sprint review are then linked to the product backlog items, if they are linked to the product backlog items being used in the upcoming sprint, this is automatically documenting changes. And this then accounts for supports chapters 8.2 and 8.3, which is all about where do you get the requirements for the products and services you're developing from, and how do you actually design the products and services you're offering to the market. Doing it like this will automatically fulfill the requirements of chapters 8.2 and 8.3. Questions so far to this? All right. Then the question of all questions. Having all this in mind, what we just heard, what is then required of a knowledge database? What is then required of a knowledge database to fulfill all these requirements and to make it easy to provide comprehensive documentation for the people in charge of the documentation? So these are the requirements that I deem important and want to challenge Hallo Welt, of course, a little bit. And so these are not requirements presented in a technical way. It's I tried just to describe the general functionality, and hopefully we can have a discussion about this later on. So it starts with defined ownership and authorizations. Sounds pretty simple, and but what I mean here is that these document ownership, for example, it must be very visible. Actually, already when entering a space or a content side of a database, it should not be like, for example, in Word documents that you have to search through settings and functions and assets of a document to actually find the document owner. It should be made clear, and also it should go along with very clear authorizations for this document. Another important aspect for me is our unique identification, is the unique identification of content items. This is important to be able to reference the content items among one another. Then content creation and content release. Here it is important to track recipient information, like, for example, reading confirmation or training attendance, because this is connected to a requirement by the ISO standard. So it's all about release and documentation and proving that the people for whom this documentation is relevant have received and understood the information. And so, and like this process of making sure and proving that the content has been communicated to the relevant audience is also something that can be proved during an audit. And so it would be important to also have this history of who has received this, who has confirmed it, etc. at hand. Another thing is traceable document item control and the individual history of changes and releases. This is also very important when it comes to ISO 27001, which is information security. There, it is often talked about integrity. Integrity is a huge term, meaning that any set of data shall not be changed, or there shall not be make any addings, or anything shall be erased without having traced this change back, so that in the end of the day, you can always say what was the original information. So this is what data integrity is about. No changes, no addings, and no erasions of any data without documented change, so to be able to be traced back to the origins. Also automatic notifications about novelties and changes. And this can be, of course, a blessing and a curse at the same time, because I think you know it from different shared working spaces. Some are set like this, that like now I'm expressing myself in an exaggerated manner, but if the author of a content changes a comma, then the whole company gets a notification. And so notifications about novelties and changes are important, but I think it's also important to define the the recipients according to different statuses of the document. So, for example, work in process versus a release document. So as long as a document is not released, the list of recipients doesn't have to be the whole company. And then it's enough to maybe only send the notifications to the person who has to actually approve of the document, for example. And on the other hand, it should also be intuitive to change those settings also for the person receiving the information. Because it might just be that someone includes a person into the list of recipients and the information is actually not relevant for that person. And so to avoid just a sheer flooding of information, it should be able to adjust the recipients list to the status, and the recipients themselves should be able to make some changes about the recipient list or to unsubscribe from the recipient list. Oh, sorry. Then again, referencing documents and link directly to reference documents. So it would be nice if it would be able to not only refer to a certain document, but then to directly jump into the document. And this, of course, requires that the link stays valid, even though there might have been changes to where the document is being stored. And also, the link should always be connected to the latest version of this content item. This is again an important aspect when it comes to performance evaluation. It would be great if it would be possible to feed verification and proof documents, if it would be able to feed verification, proof documents, and collected data directly into a certain space, into a certain content item, to have all the information together. Just as an example, imagine if some of you have been to an airport lately and you went to the bathroom, there is this customer survey panel where you choose, was the bathroom clean, not so clean, or was it dirty? By tapping these smileys, like this happy smiley for everything was clean and nice, the neutral smiley for it was okay, and the sad looking smiley for it was not so nice. And it would be great if this information then could directly be linked to, for example, the working instruction that says in what intervals to clean the bathrooms. It would also be nice if there would be a function that allows to extract content or provide text modules for aided document creation. So creating documentation, of course, is not the same as writing a novel. Doesn't have to sound nice, but it needs to be accurate and relatable. And so therefore, it would be great if it would be possible to extract content or provide these text modules. And also it would just be a little bit more efficient if there were text modules available or extracted content. And last but not least, a nice to have, I've already talked about the possibility to link content items to collected data. And if possible, if it would be possible to also add a widget maybe that shows the current display of the KPI that is being tracked. So this would be such a nice to have. So from my side, the general functionalities that I would like to see in a knowledge database to have it fit to cover the requirements of an integrated management system that is created to actually fulfill the requirement of the ISO standards. And now on my last slide before I come to an end, I would like to address that dangerous myth I've been also already mentioning in the agenda. So another commonality of ISO standards, agile frameworks, and databases is that I very often hear people assuming that if they introduce one of this trio or the whole trio together, this might result in less work. But to me, the main benefit is not that this will reduce your workload. And it is also, I don't want to say impossible, but I would like to say not very likely, because requirements get increasingly complex. So the main benefit of introducing this trio should not be reducing the workload, but the main benefit for me will be that they simply help you keep up with their increasingly complex requirements by establishing and maintaining an efficient working culture and providing effective tools. This is what those three actually do for you. So, meaning they will help you to focus on the right things, meaning skip efforts that slow down processes. Of course, if you have a good working database, you can find information quicker, meaning you don't have to spend so much time on getting the information together. But still, as I said, requirements are getting more and more complex, not only when it comes to the products themselves, but also when it comes to what documentation has to fulfill. So skipping efforts that slow down the process and help you to scale your company's performance regarding those processes that will really make the change facing the market. And so, as I said, the result will not necessarily be less working hours, but the result will be more effective output and more comprehensive output, and also be more consistent output, meaning because what the standards and what the agile frameworks are all about are repeatable processes that will result in consistent quality, so that the customer will know, once I work together with Hallo Welt, I will always get the quality that I'm used to, and Hallo Welt will be reliable, and this makes my company then reliable. And so this means more customer satisfaction, which will then lead to a better market position. And this better market position then will give you the ability to focus more on employee well-being. Because, of course, in the end of the day, it's going to be your colleagues and your employees that will develop and provide the products and services you're selling on the market. And with that being said, I just like to point out that documentation, no matter if it's about agile frameworks or classic project management, documentation has to fulfill so many functions. It has legal aspects, it has customer satisfaction aspects, it has standards aspects, etc., etc. And so I would just like to promote the idea that documentation indeed is a skill. Documentation that covers it all is a skill. And therefore, of course, the right database to process all this is needed, but also the right mindset when doing the project, when developing products, is all contributing to the comprehensive documentation in the end.
It seems that the term agile is used much more generally than the Scrum framework. What does it mean if development teams have an agile approach but don't use Scrum? Can you work agile without Scrum, like doing sprints but not have formal daily Scrums?
Okay, so I see two questions in this post. So one, there are just different agile frameworks, like, for example, Prince. But this is not a framework where I am trained. This is what I just meant. There are different, let's say, titles that would present an agile framework. And then the second question that I see here, like, okay, can you work agilely without doing, for example, daily scrums? So what I see a lot in companies, that they are trying to do sort of a hybrid model. So to merge their classic project management, what they have been used to in the past, to certain Scrum elements that they deem favorable for them. And like, of course, like if you do Scrum, for example, without daily Scrum, it is simply not precisely Scrum. So meaning if you don't introduce the full framework, in the end just means that you also don't get the full benefits. Because what are the daily Scrums for? These daily Scrums are for to give the company the opportunity to react to situations that might come up right now, the moment they appear. This is why the team is supposed to come together on a daily basis. The daily Scrum should not take long. It's designed to take like maybe 15 minutes. It's actually the main question is everything okay? Or are there some problems? If the answer is everything okay, then it doesn't even have to take those 15 minutes. But if there are problems, then the Scrum Master will take this thing and run to the management and clarify while the team continues to work. Also, one important aspect that I also find very often is, so the Scrum framework says a sprint should not be longer than 30 days. And I find it very often that companies say, well, 30 days is too short term. This is especially when, for example, machine building companies that are just used to way longer periods of development try to transfer to agile processes. And but the reason behind why this development period should be so short, I mean, of course, it comes from software development because they want to give their customer frequent updates. But another reason is to really motivate you to like break down the whole project into small portions so that you in general just become quicker. And this is also something, if you try to work agile but you set the sprints too long, then this also just kind of slows down the project. But I really get the difficulty for especially machine building companies behind this. This is not so easy for them to introduce. But this is one of the many situations where I find some companies will introduce parts of Scrum, but not the full Scrum Agile framework.
So the thing is that I think that I can only speak about BlueSpice, so I will only talk about that. But I think we can address the most of the requirements today already. And there were a few where I would say, maybe 80%, or we can enhance that functionalities here. But if you go through that, you can any document assign to a person, a role, a group of people. We use now mostly semantic MediaWiki for that. That's the technical background. So we give it put a metadata there, and then you see, okay, who is responsible for that. You can manage ownerships that way. Individual history changes is a standard. It's a standard of wiki technologies. What's also interesting is you should also be have the option to trace if somebody has made some approvals or workflows, who was in the workflow. So we are already managing that. So we have logs where you can look this up, and maybe in the future we make this easier readable, but it's already here. So for the audits, and if you want to really do some research, who was responsible for that, you can do this already.
Yes, you know what I find, and you're right, certain technologies are a standard when it comes to wikis. I see a difference. So I work a lot with machine building companies and automotive industry, but I also work with software development, for example. And what I see a lot is that companies that actually provide a not physical product somehow have the tendency to use wikis, whereas companies that provide a physical product have and I say a tendency, I have no statistical data, but from what I see, have a tendency to use ERP systems like SAP, ABAS, etc.
Okay.
And like, this is a tendency that I see in my projects. And this is what I mean, like, I don't have statistical data to back this, but from my experience. And then I see very often that people try to, build the management system on the structure of the ERP system, which follows different structures, because many ERP systems are designed in the way that you should actually follow the process of the ERP system, and many ERP systems are not designed to follow your process.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and this is what I see with many of companies coming from ERP systems, that they do have these problems with traceability and indication of ownership, etc. And you are right, I don't see this so much in companies where wikis are really being not only installed, but where they really work with the wikis. Because what I also see is that, for example, but I don't see this very often, but still I see it, that wikis are used for things like more like communication with the employees, like company news, and it's like what is being published to the staff, but sometimes not always for really working processes. And so this is just another difference that I would like to point out. And also where I see that companies like Hallo Welt also would maybe have possibility to communicate with these machine building companies, because, as I said, tools like SAP or ABAS, they actually want to bring their process into the company. Yeah. And so by then trying to modeling the ERP system to your process, I don't want to say destroy, but it distracts the original process of the ERP system so much that you don't get the full performance of it anymore.
Yeah, I understand. So this is an interesting point, that you have different approaches in certain industries. So I think that's true, and it's still a bit work to do to convince companies or managements that wiki is a solution for them. It's not very common, because most people think, okay, wiki is still something where you share knowledge. This is something everybody can change everything. They don't see that at least we at Hallo Welt made a huge effort to address ISO standards problems. And you have then both worlds. So you can work agile and sharing knowledge very freely, and you have a place for your regulations, and which is, I think, an exciting approach, is now to think that together and say, okay, you can fulfill your regulations working agile in a certain way. So that is something where I see, okay, I didn't see that before in that way or with that clarity.
Then I'm very happy that I could point this out and I could make this clear. And also, yes, I mean, the quality people, the quality guys are in many cases not like the favorites in the company, because we are the ones asking for documentation and audits, etc., etc. But yeah, to me, it just makes sense. I like doing this. And I'm always very happy when I can point out these commonalities that actually, because I feel that very often ISO standards are perceived as sort of a bureaucracy monster. And this is what can happen if you don't implement it right. But I think if you really see that agile, that the ISO standards actually want the same, like, for example, agile frameworks, which are perceived as very fancy, actually, this could help the whole topic.
Yes, that's right. And I also agree that the value of a company is increasing. And in some regards, I would expect that there is no real alternative than to get your documentation done. For one, just only one reason, one of thousands. But if you see that so many employees are just working 3 or 4 years in a company, then it changed to another place. So maybe if the management is changing, so who cares? But but the people who are doing the work, for them it's crucial that they can onboard, that they can follow what is happening, what have we done so far, and I don't see any alternative to do this. I know there are different industries, and if you have a huge startup, okay, they are used to just go forward. But even then, there comes a moment when they have to start to get defined situations.
From this point of view of simply providing the information, I absolutely agree with Mr. Glaser, because I think this email flooding, this notification flooding can be counterproductive at a certain point. And so what I mean from the point of view of the standards, it is just important to have a document that shows, for example, the new working guideline for a CNC grinder has been read and understood by the person working with that machine. And if the linking in the document allows to show, let's say, Markus Glaser has read and understood, this is the item that you need to meet the requirements from the standard. But I totally agree that from the point of view of the recipient, it would be actually great to have settings that give you like a summarized notification. And for example, Jira has this, but this setting is very difficult to find. I can't even like quickly explain how we did this then, but because of that, because we got notifications about every comma, and that was changed. And yes, and what I meant with this point is it should be just easy for the recipient to set those changes so that the recipient can decide, I think for me, it is enough if I get a summary, daily, weekly, monthly, whatever.